Hi all, welcome to the webinar. I'll just pass you over to our host, Kate Halliwell.
Thanks ever so much, Robin. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the IFST webinar, Milk It for All It's Worth, 60 Years of Processing the Past, the Present, and the Art of the Possible. This has been organised by IFST's Food Science and Nutrition SIG. And I chair that special interest group at IFST. I'm also the Chief Scientific Officer at the Food and Drink Federation, and I'm going to be your host for today. As I'm sure many people on the call will know, this is a special year for IFST as it celebrates its diamond anniversary. And when we were talking about this in the SIG, it got us thinking about common foodstuffs that in your head you probably think haven't changed over time because they're so fundamental. But actually, quite a lot has changed within that 60-ish. We're giving a little bit of variability either side, but around about 60 years. And that might be how they're processed, the nutrition of them, our understanding of them, and indeed what we choose to buy as consumers. And of course, what is more fundamental than milk? It's a product that on the one hand seems really simple. People around the world would know what milk is and think they have an understanding of it. But actually, we've seen some really quite dramatic shifts within that time period of our understanding of what we buy, of how we process it. And if we think about plant-based, even what we consider to be milk is very different to 60 years ago. So to guide us through today, we've got three brilliant speakers. So Dr. Anne Mullen, who is a lecturer at the University of Galway. We have Professor Ian Gibbons, who's the director of the Institute of Food, Nutrition and Health at the University of Reading, and Dr. Martina Rooney, who's a research scientist at the Institute of Food and Health, the University College Dublin. So in the interest of time, I am not going to go through everybody's bios. They are available on the IFST website for this event. And before I hand across to them, I'm just going to give you a quick idea about what's going to happen today. So this webinar is being recorded and it's going to be uploaded to the IFST's webinar hub. We're going to hear from each of the speakers in order, and they will hand over to each other. And then there'll be a Q&A session after all of those presentations. We're hoping for about 30 minutes of questions, so do get your questioning head on. And if you think of questions throughout the presentations, do feel free to make comments and questions throughout using the Q&A button, which should be at the bottom of your screen. If someone else has asked a question that you are desperate to have answered, then you can tick to upvote that. That just means it comes to the top of my screen, so it's more likely to get asked. And so with that, I am going to hand you across to our first speaker, Anne.
Thank you very much, Kate. I'm just going to share my screen and see where we're going. Sorry, Nat. Great. I hope you can all see my slides. My name is Dr. Anne Mullen. I'm a lecturer in nutrition security and sustainable food systems at the University of Galway in the west of Ireland, Ulscoil na Gaillimhe. From 2014 to 2023, I was the Director of Nutrition for the Dairy Council of Great Britain and the launch chief editor of the scientific journal Nature Food. In these two roles, I communicated other people's science, and I commissioned reviews and opinion pieces on a whole range of topics, including the health benefits of milk, dairy, and then more broadly into sustainable food systems. And it's my experience from these two roles in the Dairy Council and in Nature Food that I speak to you today. My presentation is based on my own views and don't represent the views of particularly of the Dairy Council, Dairy UK, Nature Food or Springer Nature. My current research is in the University of Galway is on nutrition security in low and middle income countries, particularly in sustainable food systems. So I'm going to cover 3 points in this short presentation. The first is that milk and dairy foods are nutritious with health benefits throughout the life course. However, there are challenges that exist for consumers, and we must look beyond traditional nutrition in our messaging. And finally, despite these challenges, there's growth globally in the consumption of milk and dairy products. And we'll begin with that final point first. I present to you here 60 years worth of data, global data on the consumption of milk and dairy products, excluding butter. I got this data from, or this figure from Our World in Data, who took the data itself from the FAO. You'll notice that it's per capita milk consumption from 1961 to 1921. In fact, it really is supply rather than consumption, as the data is based on food balance sheets rather than consumption from dietary databases. What you'll notice here is that over the course of those years, the global per capita consumption of milk and dairy products increased somewhat. In countries like Ireland and the UK, it increased in Ireland, for example, from 286 kilograms per capita per person about 60 years ago to 316. Ireland is the top line on that figure on the left, and you'll see it's quite variable in terms of consumption. The other countries below that, the high consumers, North America, Australia, United Kingdom, and Europe, for example, have remained relatively static. But you'll notice, and I'm sure you've heard in the media and elsewhere, that the real growth has been in low and middle income countries in terms of consumption. We see South America there, but also we know that in Asia, for example, the growth in consumption per capita of milk and dairy products has increased by about threefold between 1961 and 1921. And in China in particular, it has increased 14-fold. And you'll see from these figures that actually that increase has happened more or less in the past 25 years. And why wouldn't it really? We know that milk and dairy products have a fundamental role in nutrition security and in human development, in fact. And the FAO have always promoted milk and dairy in these regards. Most notably, I just want to draw your attention to the figure on the bottom right, which is the FAO's 2023 report. And that 2023 report was on terrestrial foods. It's a comprehensive report, and it covers a whole range of topics that relate to nutrition from milk and dairy products, supporting health throughout the life course, and with particular focus on low and middle income countries. So my first argument is that milk is undoubtedly nutritious throughout the life course. Milk and dairy have a great nutrition story to tell. For example, there has been over the years great research into linear growth and its association in childhood with the consumption of milk and dairy. What I'm particularly interested, given my work in low and middle income countries, is how milk and dairy have increasingly been associated with reductions in stunting, which is a critical factor in not only childhood development, but human development. And I've just presented two papers here on young child nutrition, reduction of stunting associated with milk consumption. And they're very, very recent papers from low and middle income countries. These studies interestingly show that while dairy consumption is associated with income, and income is associated with reduction in stunting, dairy has an independent effect on the prevention and the reduction of stunting. In terms of obesity and childhood obesity, there's also some really, really good evidence out there that shows that milk consumption and dairy consumption is inversely associated with obesity in young children, but also adiposity or body fatness. And the second paper here is a really cool paper from Denmark, where in children who are already predisposed to obesity, replacing sugar-sweetened beverages with milk, for example, was inversely associated with weight gain. I like this paper. It's really, really pragmatic. We also know that milk and dairy are very important for growth and development throughout childhood and in the adolescent years. And I'm going to focus very briefly on calcium and iodine. National Diet Nutrition Survey, the NDNS, tells us that 16% of teenagers, and in fact it's 22% of teenage girls, are in the lower reference nutrient intake range for calcium. And about 27% of teenage girls are in that lower reference nutrient intake for iodine. While about a third of each intake of calcium and iodine actually comes from milk and dairy products in this age group, we see that the intake actually kind of pretty much nosedives after early childhood. The NDNS shows us that the intake of milk and dairy products plummets in the 11 to 18-year-olds. It continues to stay very low in the 19 to 64-year-olds, and then it rises again in older adulthood. This represents an opportunity for promoting milk and dairy products to improve micronutrient status, growth, and development in teenage years. In terms of iodine and infant development, Sarah Bath and others have presented really interesting information from the ALSPAC cohort that shows urinary iodine urinary iodine associated with or representative of mild to moderate deficiency in pregnancy is associated in later years in the early childhood years with reduced abilities in reading, in writing, in verbal development. So during pregnancy, obviously milk and dairy products as a great source of iodine in the British and Irish diets are incredibly important. Ian and Martina are going to talk about cardiometabolic disease and the cool research that's coming out there, so I won't dwell on that. But I do want to move on to some really important information from the World Cancer Research Fund, which I don't think is really promoted enough. And this is around cancer risk in milk and dairy consumption. The World Cancer Research Fund report indicates that there's a decreased risk of colorectal cancer with consumption of dairy products. There's some evidence of decreased risk of premenopausal breast cancer associated with dairy intake. And there's a possible increased risk at higher consumption of milk and dairy products of prostate cancer. And finally, the last stage of the life course that I'm going to, or the last health-related issue to do with life course that I'm going to talk about is age-related decline in muscle mass and function, frailty and sarcopenia. And there's really, really great research coming out about the role of milk and dairy products, but also their constituents, their constituent proteins, their constituent amino acids, and of course with exercise and physical activity in mitigating age-related sarcopenia and decline in muscle mass and function. So this research is really, really interesting, and it does show undoubtedly that throughout the life course, milk and dairy products have really, really important effects. But there are challenges to communicating this great story, and I'm going to touch on those in the last few minutes of my presentation. First of all, I just want to show you some information that I pulled from Scopus, just to show you how the field of research into milk and dairy nutrition has grown, and actually really how relatively new it is. Dariush Mozaffarian and others published a paper in the British Medical Journal quite a few years ago around the history of modern nutrition science. And I think it's really worth remembering that modern nutrition science, my science, is around 100 years old. In fact, the sole study or the study of vitamins in isolation really began in the 1920s. So just to point out that actually in terms of the research that we have around milk, dairy, nutrition, it's really, really started to grow in recent years. So the full story that we can communicate with certainty to the public is limited. It's also limited by things like health and nutrition claims regulations that prevent us from communicating as health professionals the full story around this exciting research to the public. We have to be quite moderate in our messaging. So I want to talk about some of those challenges that I experienced working in the Dairy Council, but also working in science communication and publishing around communicating nutrition stories, and particularly communicating milk and dairy nutrition stories. Like many fields of nutrition, milk and dairy suffers from its own fair share of myths, misinformation, and mixed messages. For example, they're related to nutrition content and the health effects of dairy. There are myths and misinformation in the public domain around things like hormones, cancer risk, lactose intolerance, milk allergy. As scientists, we're very, very capable of dealing with uncertainty, but that uncertainty doesn't translate very well to the public. And so we need to take a few steps as scientists to try and mitigate the misinformation and the mixed messages that very often the media portray to the public. There are three steps we can take as scientists. The first one is to ensure that we report our own findings in an accurate and a moderate way. I think that's incredibly important. The second is that we engage with press offices, our own university and institutional press offices, but also press offices of scientific journals. And finally, that we also ensure that our research is always, in as much as possible, open science and adheres to the FAIR principles, so that our data and our results are findable, that they're accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So there's some things we can do to communicate the good nutrition story about milk and dairy through open science and good practices. Another challenge is the inconsistencies around food-based dietary guidelines. What we notice from country to country, from region to region, the messages are quite different. In Ireland, for example, we have a message of consuming 3 portions per day, whereas in the UK, the message is to consume some dairy. I also want to point to the fact that, and I think Martina touches on it later on with the food matrix, is that people don't eat nutrients, they eat foods. So our messaging around the nutritional benefits of dairy need to be embedded in wider dietary patterns, food environments. These are things like cost, affordability, the food access people have, and the wider policy environments that informs food environments. And finally, I want to touch on something that I hope will come up in the Q&A. We often work across purposes when we're talking about nutrition and health when it comes to dairy, because there are other issues around planetary health, sustainability, and activism that we need to address. And because of that, I really adhere to the food, or I advocate for the food systems approach to understand systematically the benefits of milk and dairy to economy, to the environment, to society, and to human health. So with that, I want to say thank you. In Irish, it's Gurmahagav. And if you want to try that at home, I've written it out phonetically for you. Thank you very much for your time. Ian, your presentation is next, so over to you.
Thank you very much, Anne. I guess I need to wait? Yeah. Wait for your slides to disappear. So I'll just share mine. And hopefully that's coming through clearly. Okay, good. Thank you very much for that introduction, Anne. And can I just start by thanking the Institute for the invitation to talk to you today. It's really, I really appreciate it and really like it. Maybe just to say that, as Anne did, my role really in this area for the last 20 years, I guess, really has been very much focused on understanding the association between milk and dairy product consumption and the risk of chronic disease, particularly cardiovascular disease, but also cardiometabolic disease, and other things. And more recently, we've taken a much greater interest in the functionality of some of the components of milk, particularly the proteins, but other components as well. And the functionality of these is really important, and you can't really explain the functionality in traditional nutrition terms, which is one of the challenges I think we have in communicating this information. Anyway, so I'm going to give you a quick whiz through about 60 years in relation predominantly to nutrition and health. I thought I would just say a little bit about the changes that have been in milk processing, not in any great detail, but I think it's quite interesting that, you know, the three of the processes that we now have come to live with, if you like, pasteurization, UHT, and homogenization, had a very early start. You know, they started back in the 1890s, which surprised me when I went to look at this. But it's really only in the last, well, since the 1970s, really, that they've developed into, you know, improvements in hygiene, changed the different way UHT works, and also in homogenization as well, improved hygienic design of the plants. The two more newer processes, of course, down below is fat standardization and membrane filtration. Both of those actually have a slightly longer history than I thought they would. There was some attempts at membrane filtration back in the 60s, but for both of them, really, it was the 1990s when they began to become commercially feasible, as you can see there. So it is interesting how far back some of these processes go, which I think was interesting, yes. And of course, the question arises from that: why do we bother processing milk anyway? Because you know, you can buy raw milk. There's a number of these machines around the country. You can take your own container and fill it up, provided you put the money in the machine. And you can see that there's a great divergence of opinion on the value of raw milk. The Daily Mirror thought that it was, you know, responsible for one of the worst food poisoning outbreaks. The Raw Milk Institute, which I don't know, but it's highlighting the fact that children who drink raw milk have less allergies. And there is actually some evidence for that, actually, which is quite interesting. I'm not sure, you know, how big raw milk is now. It was certainly had increased the last time I looked at it, but it is something that divides opinion quite a lot. And in fact, it's banned in Scotland, apparently. So they obviously don't like it. I think that the risk is too great. This is a slide, again, going back, it's about 50 years, not 60, but it's really looking at the changeover that's happened quite quickly, but quite remarkably in some ways, between consumption of whole milk and the switch, around the early 90s to predominantly skim milk, semi-skim milk. And the change was about 1993 when they crossed over, and semi-skim milk's been reasonably flat since then. Fully skimmed never really got very far. UHT milk really has not got very far either. Although, of course, in countries neighbouring us, it is a very big part of their milk consumption. So again, this raises the question, why did people switch over to semi-skim milk? I suspect it was because of the publicity there's always been about fat being bad for you, and particularly saturated fat being bad for you. Of course, milk fat contains a lot of saturated fat. So I think that's probably some of the reason behind it. But it's not always clear whether that's actually sensible. This is the very recent, well, published 2 years ago now, I think, 2 or 3 years ago now. This is the Milky Way study carried out in Western Australia. It was part of a PhD project, which I was one of the examiners of, actually. But this was a study that done with children, about 5 years old on average. It's a double-blind randomized control trial, where the children were either randomized to whole fat dairy products, it was not just milk, but milk, cheese, and yogurt mainly, or reduced fat products for a 3-month period, which is quite a while. And you can see at the end of the 3-month period, as you would expect, the energy intake from fat in the whole fat group was, more than double that for the reduced fat group. But what was the outcome of that? The outcome was essentially nothing. There was no effect on any measures of adiposity, body composition, blood pressure, all the things that you would measure. The only thing that really emerged was that the children that were consuming the whole fat products actually had a higher concentrations of serum long-chain N-3 fatty acids, which, you can argue whether that's much benefit or not, but it's certainly in the direction that you would expect to be beneficial. So it's a question, I think, whether the fat reduced thing is correct or not. I know this is not with adults, and there's some of the evidence for adults which is a bit conflicting, to be honest, but it's not simple. Anne mentioned this already. This is a slightly different way of looking at the drop in milk consumption in the teenage years, particularly in teenage girls. It's massive, and as I think Anne said, the recovery period is very slow. And one of the big issues in that period, which I think Anne mentioned, is that, of course, that period, that adolescent period, is the biggest period of the biggest period of bone mineralization. And if you don't get bone mineralization right in that period, you run the risk of having much weaker bones in later life, particularly women postmenopausally. And, we may be already setting ourselves up for a problem in about 30 or 40 years, which we hadn't predicted. But that is a real worry. And the other nutrients also that, of course, they're missing that Anne mentioned. This is a collection of meta-analyses. So each of the lines you can see on the right here each one's a meta-analysis, not a single study. And this is the association between dairy consumption, milk, cheese, yogurt, etc., and the range of cardiometabolic diseases in that family, if you like. And everything that's in yellow, you can see, is neutral. So milk, no increased risk of cardiovascular disease, yogurt, the same, and cheese as well for stroke. But the ones I've highlighted in a pinkish color, show a reduced risk. So you can see there's a reduced risk of stroke in this set and in this set, and also reduced risk of type 2 diabetes in those two meta-analyses. And the evidence for yogurt actually is quite interesting, because there are now a number of studies that have shown yogurt to be potentially protective against type 2 diabetes. And that, I think that should be looked at in much greater detail fairly quickly, given the rise in prevalence of type 2 diabetes. And coming up to date, really, one of the big questions we always get asked now is this whole issue of dietary transition from animal-based, well, it's nearly always animal protein that people talk about, ignoring the fact that other things are present. And this is just a very simple example that I've used for students mainly. If we want to replace 7 grams of protein in milk by soybeans, You can see the milk provides us with 7 grams of protein, a high quality score. It also provides us with, a lot of calcium, a lot of iodine, and although it doesn't look a lot of vitamin B12, there's actually enough there for most people's daily needs, if you like. If you then replace that with soybean, you can see these still have 7 grams of protein, but you have a much lower quality score. You've lost a high proportion of the calcium. You actually gained a little bit of magnesium. You lost nearly all the iodine, and you lost all the vitamin B12. So it's not simply just a question of replacing protein, which is what tends to be talked about. And finally, and I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but just to highlight the fact that, and this may come up in the discussion later, just to highlight the fact that we're now almost swamped by the range of these so-called milk alternative drinks. I'm not using the word milk for them, but many people do. And there have been, a lot of problems with these particularly in young children. There was actually a case in Belgium where the child became extremely ill and died mainly because of lack of protein, I think. And the parents were actually convicted of killing the child through malnutrition. I think the sentence they got was quite lenient. It wasn't like for murder, but nevertheless, that's the extreme. But there's quite a few cases in between, if you like, which is really highlighting the fact that these are not simple replacements for milk. So I see my time is just about up. I will say thank you very much, and we will no doubt have some questions at the end. Thank you. And I'll now after I've stopped sharing, I have stopped sharing. Hand over now to Dr. Martina Rooney from University College Dublin, and we'll hear what Martina has to say. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ian and Anne, for lovely presentations, and Ian for introducing me. I think everyone should be able to see my slides there now. So thanks very much to IFST for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all today about the benefits of the dairy matrix. Now, some of you may have heard about this before, but it may be new to some of you as well. So just need to get rid of my videos there. So the food matrix then, so foods consist of a large number of different nutrients that are contained within a complex structure. So the nature of the food structure and the nutrients within this structure will determine the nutrient digestion and absorption, and thereby alter the overall nutritional properties of the food. So there are a lot of words there, but I'll go through it in more detail with respect to dairy foods over the next few slides. But traditionally, when we're in nutritional science, when we're doing research and thinking about this, we do think about nutrients and health. Nutrients and health. We don't always think about diet or foods and health. And when we think about just nutrients and health, this can be seen as a reductionist approach. And as I said, we eat foods and we don't eat single nutrients. So, and then this doesn't allow for the study of that food matrix effect. Otherwise. So what about milk, yogurt and cheese then? So the nutrients contained within milk, yogurt and cheese, we have a wide variety of very important nutrients that are important for health. So as we can see on the figure here, we have lots of macronutrients. So we have lots of fatty acids. We have whey and casein are the proteins, and then the carbohydrates are predominantly lactose. So they are the macronutrients just in the orange at the top of each of those images. Dairy products also provide a lot of minerals. If we think about dairy products, we automatically think of calcium, maybe phosphorus as well, but dairy products are a really important contributor to the iodine and selenium status in populations such as Ireland and the UK. And it's great to see nutrients like selenium and iodine receive a lot more attention these days. Moving on to vitamins then. So again, lots of vitamins in dairy products, and the one we would automatically think of might be vitamin D. But B vitamins are also really, lots of B vitamins in dairy products, in particular riboflavin. So dairy products are a key contributor to riboflavin status in Ireland and the UK, and they're also a really good source of vitamin B12. And finally, in purple, then kind of the least prevalent one, there are the bioactives. So there's lots of other bioactives that probably lots of us have never heard of and never will hear of after today. But bioactives may be such as milk fat globule membrane, or oligosaccharides, or immunoglobulins, and other bioactives like that. So they're all the really important essential nutrients that are contained within these foods. But the dairy matrix then really refers to how these foods are contained within that structure within the food. So if we think about milk, milk is a liquid, so that has a liquid matrix, and that affects how those nutrients are contained within that liquid or dairy matrix. If we look at yogurt then, so yogurt is not a liquid, it's a semi-solid or a gel. So those nutrients are contained within that dairy matrix within a solid or a gel. And then further different, again, it's cheese. So cheese is quite hard, and that has a different cheese dairy matrix that is different to milk and yogurt. And again, this matrix, that structure of how these nutrients are held within the foods, really contributes to how those foods are digested, absorbed, and metabolized, and that can link to their effects on health as well. So if we think of cheese in particular, but especially dairy matrix, and Ian touched on this in his slides as well, in addition to those nutrients that we talked about, dairy products do contain a lot of saturated fat, and there's salt in cheese as well. And if we think of saturated fat and salt, they do have negative connotations with health, in particular cardiovascular health. And Ian had that lovely slide on his presentation with all the recent meta-analyses linking dairy products and cardiovascular health or cardiometabolic health. And we could clearly see that there is a neutral or beneficial effect, in some cases, effect of dairy products on cardiometabolic health. And that is what I'm going to talk about with the rest of the presentation today, because it can be shown then that dairy's unique blend of nutrients, when consumed together, so again, within that dairy matrix, can be linked with positive or neutral health effects. So first of all, I'm going to talk about some cross-sectional studies or some cross-sectional work from the National Adult Nutrition Survey in Ireland. So they looked at 1,500 people, and these people were broken down into 3 clusters of dietary or dairy food intake. So the first group was the whole milk cluster. So again, these people were eating whole milk, whole butter, whole cheese, whole milk, whole cheese, whole yogurt. There was the reduced fat milks and yogurt group, so they were eating the reduced fat versions of these foods, and then there was the butter and the cream cluster. So between the 3 clusters, or between these 3 groups, there was a significant difference in the amount of fat and all the types of fat that these people were consuming in the whole milk group and the butter and cream group compared to the reduced fat milks and yogurt group. So again, those people who were consuming the full fat varieties of dairy products did have a higher intake of fat overall compared to those who were consuming the reduced fat version. However, when we looked more closely then at body composition, there's absolutely no difference in BMI or body fat across these 3 clusters. So that was really interesting. Despite these higher fat intakes and saturated fat intakes in those who were consuming the whole dairy products, no difference in anthropometry was observed. However, when we looked at cholesterol levels, those who were consuming those in the whole milk cluster actually had significantly lower cholesterol than those who were in the reduced fat milks and yogurt cluster. So this was really interesting, and this had some support of the dairy matrix effect, particularly with respect to cholesterol concentrations. But this was cross-sectional, this observational work, and so a randomized control trial was conducted. So there was a cheese matrix study, and this tested the effect of fat within and outside the cheese matrix on markers of cardiometabolic health. So as people aged over 50 with a BMI of 25 kilograms per meter squared or over, so these people were already at increased risk of cardiometabolic disease, but they were otherwise healthy. They weren't taking cholesterol medications or blood pressure medications or anything like that. So what we did is that they were provided with about 42 grams of fat per day, provided within 3 different matrices for 6 weeks, and we looked at the total cholesterol and other lipid parameters after that then. So the first group was a full fat cheese. So within the cheese, all the saturated fat was contained completely within that dairy matrix. In group B, it was a reduced fat cheese and a butter. So about half the fat was contained within the dairy matrix and about half the fat was outside that dairy matrix. And the final group then was where we deconstructed those cheese ingredients. So there was no matrix at all in this group C. It was just butter, it was just protein powder, and it was just calcium. So those key ingredients and nutrients that we find in cheese, but we just removed that dairy the cheese matrix from that. So after 6 weeks, we tested their cholesterol levels, and this is what we found. So we have total cholesterol in the left-hand side, HDL cholesterol in the middle, and LDL cholesterol on the right-hand side. And we can clearly see that there was a stepwise reduction in the reduction in both total and LDL cholesterol, with the more amount of fat that was included in that dairy matrix. So in group A, there was the greatest reduction in both total and LDL cholesterol. And this group A was the group that consumed the full fat cheese. So all the fat was contained in that dairy matrix. The next group, there wasn't a significant difference between the two groups here, but when some of that fat was removed, there was still a reduction in cholesterol, but not as much as when all the fat was included within the matrix. And then in that final deconstructed group, there was the smallest reduction in both total and LDL cholesterol. So this was really, really exciting and really, really important work to see as well. And that's published in AJCN if anyone wants to have a read of that. So as I said, that was really exciting. That was great work, but what was the next steps? So now this study is underway at the moment. So we're looking at the effect of the cheese form on cholesterol concentrations. So instead of looking at those ingredients within the cheese, we're now looking at the structure. So the group A is still that full fat, solid whole cheese, whereas now this time group B is now a full fat melted cheese, and group C is still that deconstructed cheese. So what we're really looking at with group B is we're melting that cheese, we're physically deconstructing that, physically deconstructing the matrix or the structure of the cheese, and we're going to investigate what effect that has on cardiometabolic health. So watch that space. So overall, the take-home message from today is, from my talk, is that dairy products such as milk, cheese, and dairy do form part of a healthy diet. And thank you very much to everyone who is involved in this study, and also everyone for listening today. And if you have any questions, please do ask questions now in the Q&A, or you can contact me here. And thanks very much. I'll hand back over to Kate now.
Thank you very much, Martina. And I'll just let the other speakers get their cameras on. So thank you to everyone for that range of talks. I think gave us a really great overview of what's been going on in dairy. And we're going to move into the Q&A session. So can I remind you to submit questions for our speakers? You do that using the Q&A button, which will be at the bottom of your screen. So whilst people think of what they want to ask, I will kick us off. And Anne, maybe I will come back to you, partly because I'm conscious I cut you slightly short as you were going through some of the kind of communications, I suppose, of it. And you talked about kind of taking us beyond our traditional ways of communicating. And I just wondered if you wanted to expand out a little bit on that.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I suppose we very often when we're communicating as health professionals and as scientists, but mainly health professionals, when we're communicating about foods, we talk about nutrients, and we label foods with nutrient labels. We, reformulate foods so that meet certain nutrient targets. So it's very nutrient focused. And Martina used the lovely word reductionist, and it's quite right. I think that reductionism works very well for certain parts of, say, the food industry, for scientists, for measuring things. Those kind of metrics are great, but they don't work so well for communicating messages. So I do think when I say moving beyond traditional nutrition, I think we need to move messages, make them more sophisticated beyond the reductionist messages of calcium is good for you, iodine is this, blah, blah, blah. We need to move to talk about foods. Certainly, that's one thing, because people eat foods. But I do think we need to engage more with food environments. That's, talking more about tapping into what people are interested in terms of affordability, their access to foods, cultural aspects of foods as well, really important. And what I really wanted to get at as well was combining messages around sustainability, environmental sustainability with health. That's, for me, the golden ticket. How do we communicate to people who are genuinely, citizens or consumers are genuinely clued in about environmental issues? And how do we combine those kind of messages with good, solid nutrition? I'll just finish by saying that, we're very good at communicating quantitative nutrients, how many nutrients are in something. But when it comes to environmental messaging, there's a huge amount of greenwashing going on, around certain food products. So I think that we need, as food scientists, to just get very sophisticated in how we combine those messages that are still evidence-based, but they tap into the concerns of citizens.
And I guess that probably leads me maybe across to Ian and thinking about, I mean, we are seeing, probably partly driven through sustainability concerns, a bit of a transition, I think, from dairy into some, particularly on the milk side, milk-based alternatives. So from dairy into plant proteins. And do you think, well, I suppose one, do you think that's a good direction of travel? I know that's a complicated question, but what are the kind of misunderstood elements of that, as we undoubtedly are seeing a bit of a transition in where we are getting our protein sources from?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think to go back to the first question you asked, I think there is some justification for some movement. And there's one good reason for that, is that, you know, as a population, I'm speaking about the UK population, but it's fairly widespread, we consume vastly less amount of dietary fiber than we should. You know, it's way down. And I think some movement into plants actually providing a bit more of that would be quite helpful. The second point about oh no, sorry, I was also going to say is that, of course, despite the fact that we have a very low dietary fiber intake, we have a very high sugar intake. You know, it's about 3 times the target on average. And I think also people tend to forget that sugar actually comes from plants. You know, so it's not necessarily a simple thing. But coming to the second point, I mean, it's more or less, I think, what I said in the presentation. I think that the major uncertainty or lack of knowledge, in a sense, is the fact that if we want to replace protein, which people talk about, we have to recognize that if we replace milk protein or even meat protein, we will also be losing some of the nutrients that they actually normally would provide. I mean, you know, my simple little thing was talking about calcium and vitamin B12, but there are obviously other nutrients as well. And I think we have to get across that message that, you know, it's not as simple just replacing so much protein with plant protein. We have to take into account the other nutrients that that milk, particularly milk and dairy products, provide. And that actually kind of comes back to the point I was raising, I think, about the environment. The traditional way of comparing foods in terms of environmental impact has been per kilogram, largely. And there is movement now to change that, but it definitely should change. It should be based on nutrient supply, or more like a functional unit, which people are talking about, which is a combination of things. But just comparing on a kilogram per kilogram basis is misleading and I think useless.
Come in on that, because I know you also were quite keen to talk through the kind of Eat Lancet study and some of the aspects of sustainable diets and milk dairy consumption.
Well, I mean, the Eat Lancet diet has had enormous publicity, as though it was the sort of, you know, as a target we should all be going for. But in fact, there's a group in the States, one of which I've met, that have been re-looking at the Eat Lancet diet. And the Eat Lancet diet actually misses out on a number of key nutrients, like iodine and vitamin B12 to some extent. So there's a range of nutrients which Eat Lancet diet doesn't provide enough of, which I think it needs to be adjusted for. But it's not perfect. Can't hear you, Kate.
Could I respond very, very quickly to that as well? Ian, I agree with you about shortcomings in the Eat Lancet diet. I remember when the Eat Lancet came out in 2019, and it was just, I actually really thought it was a landmark document in that it did combine human and planetary health, and it got that conversation going.
Yeah,
I think, yeah, no, I think that's been absolutely wonderful. It's interesting that when you look at what's called the diet gap between Eat Lancet, what Eat Lancet recommends in different regions of the world, we actually find that in terms of dairy, it's North America and Europe that really need to reduce to come in line with Eat Lancet. Other parts of the world actually need to increase their dairy consumption to come in line with Eat Lancet recommendations. So this message of plant-based, I think, which I think has become more conversational since Eat Lancet, certainly in recent years, there are misperceptions around the elimination of milk and dairy, or the reduction of milk and dairy globally, in terms of having a diet that's plant-based. I think that milk and dairy products and meat actually still have a place in the Eat Lancet diet.
Yeah, I mean, they do. I think the Eat Lancet diet was much harder on meat than it was on dairy, which is
Certainly was, yeah.
quite. And I do also think that, I mean, talking about meat, which I know we're not really, but there is this confusion to think about, you know, the differences between red meat and processed meat. You know, you were quoting the World Cancer Research Fund earlier, and the World Cancer Research Fund is adamant that processed meat is a cancer risk. And I mean, my take on the whole thing is that it would be quite nice if we could reduce the amount of processed meat that we consume, and, you know, allow plants to come into that gap and provide more fiber at the same time.
Absolutely.
It's
I'm going to move as I am on to, we've had quite a lot of questions in the chat, and we might well come back to plant-based because there's a few on that. But I wanted to pick up actually with Martina to start with around, you obviously talked about cholesterol lowering implications, or effect of cheese, sorry, not implications. And I wondered if you could touch on any other cardiometabolic outcomes. And I wanted to link that because there was a question on the chat that was actually asked of Ian, but was about type 2 diabetes and kind of markers of that. So I wonder if I could start with you and then maybe go across to Ian.
Yeah, perfect. And I actually think Ian covered that really well. I actually took a photo of your slide, Ian. Thanks very much for covering all those meta-analyses there. That's a handy little guide for me to have. But yeah, definitely in the past 10 years or so, there's a huge amount of work, especially meta-analyses, pooling all that data, looking at lots of individual dairy products and dairy dietary patterns and the effect on various aspects of cardiometabolic health, including cholesterol. Obviously, the cholesterol and cheese story is really strong, but also looking at anthropometry, inflammation, type 2 diabetes, blood pressure, and things like that as well. So milk appears to be maybe more effective in controlling your blood pressure. Yogurt appears to be really good as well, maybe a bit on anthropometry. I'll let Ian talk about glycemic control. But there is a lot of really strong evidence out there at the moment. There are neutral effects. Not everything is like, oh my God, drink some milk and it will fix every ailment. It's definitely, we're not going to go that far, but there are a lot of beneficial effects, but there are also a lot of neutral effects. And that's also really good because it's not doing any harm. So as I said at the end of my slide, drink your milk and eat your cheese. And Ian, I'll hand over to you now about glycemic control.
I am always happy when there is a message that is eat cheese.
Yeah.
Delighted when this research.
I know most people are, to be fair, so you know, I bring good news.
You bring joy everywhere you go.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and Ian, as I said, there is also a specific message in the question for you about type 2 diabetes, and is there any evidence that it looks at intakes versus incidence in dairy?
Well, I think it's really what I was talking about earlier. I mean, maybe first just to say that the prevalence of type 2 diabetes is increasing enormously fast. I think the NHS reckon that they have over 700 new cases every day. And on top of that, of course, there's good estimates of how many people are out there that are becoming diabetic, but are not diagnosed, you know? So it is a massive problem in that sense. It's a massive financial problem for the NHS as well. So something really needs to be done about it. And I mean, we've been kind of interested in the yogurt story because there's now quite a number of studies which show that yogurt seems to reduce the risk. The problem is that we don't really know what the mechanism for that might be. We believe that we've constructed a biochemical mechanism, but it's not been proven. And the other problem is what type of yogurt, because if you go in the shops, you know, there's high fat yogurts, low fat, high sugar, low sugar, fruit in, no fruit in. And so there's no information on that at all. And I just think that given the evidence that we have, it should be examined in much more detail than it has been. And it might even have some read across into other fermented dairy products, you know, like cheese, for example. But the evidence for yogurt is the strongest. Having said that, there's 2 studies in the Netherlands published just last year, I think, that didn't show that with yogurt. But, you know, you've got to look at the whole picture, and there may be reasons why that was.
Presenting that, and I was thinking of Anne had a slide which had milk versus sugar sweetened beverages and impacts, and I was wondering, how much is kind of a specific mechanism of the dairy and how much could be a substitution effect, and of course it could be both. It's not necessarily an answer to that. So interesting, you've got a biochemical mechanism, Ian. I'll look out for that. There's a question here for everybody on SATFAT, so SATFAT research, and around the fact that seems to be kind of bringing through this message that if you've got the full fat or saturated fat is all there in the dairy foods, it doesn't have a negative impact, which definitely was a message. I can remember the awful day in the 80s. My parents bought back low-fat cheese. It was an incredible disappointment to me, although I should probably say that obviously those have improved greatly in the last few years. But anyway, as we get that research coming through, do you think, I guess it's coming back to messaging, how far away are we from maybe looking at more food-based guidelines and using that as our kind of public health messaging in terms of government dietary guidance, in terms of how we all talk to it? And do you think that's a better way to go? And you've already nailed your colours to the flag on that one a little bit. But if I kick off with you.
Yeah, I guess that's a really good question. I mean, what I showed in one of my slides was just how the sort of the massive growth, it's kind of, it happens in most fields anyway, but the massive growth in research on dairy, and I think a lot of it probably does relate to these novel findings around saturated fat, bioactives, various components of dairy and milk that have health benefits. In terms of the process of freely communicating these in a public domain is something that I can't particularly answer to. I wonder, potentially Ian and Martina may know about this. It's just I don't work in dairy anymore, but we used to be limited very much by nutrition and health claims about the messages we could deliver as health professionals. So I don't know what the process is, Kate. Perhaps you even know better than I do. So I'll step back from that one, except to say that there is a gap between all the research that's out there and the direction it's pointing in and what we can legitimately say in a public domain.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, I can maybe just add a little bit, not so much about what we can say, but just to highlight the fact that about 3 weeks ago, I was at a meeting of so-called experts in Amsterdam, and in fact, Emma was there as well, Martina, as you probably know. And the plan of that meeting was to really try to review the evidence that there was for, put it another way, is there strong evidence that saturated fats in dairy products don't actually have the negative effects that the people perceive them to have? That's really what it boils down to. And by the end of July, we should have a document paper with all of that, all the conclusions for that. I don't know quite what they'll all be, but there is evidence that saturated fats aren't as bad as the original evidence suggests, and there's a number of reasons for that. But one of them is the fact that when you increase the amount of saturated fat intake, although you generally get this increase in both LDL cholesterol and total cholesterol, what most cases is happening is you're getting an increase in the large buoyant LDL particles and not the small dense LDL particles, which are the ones that are most atherogenic. And so there seems to be some compensation in that, if you like. and there is also a bit of a feeling that LDL cholesterol actually is not perhaps the best predictor of risk for cardiovascular disease, even if you combine it with total HDL and total to HDL ratio, which is what the NHS here now uses. So there's a number of things. And also the fact that with dairy products, you do maybe get some compensation from the point of view of, as I think Martina said, there is a tendency with milk proteins, particularly to reduce blood pressure, which is a big risk factor. So there's probably things that counterbalance the saturates, and there's probably some of the components of the cholesterol story which are not fully exposed yet, if you like, but they might be by the end of July.
I do like a little teaser. You've obviously been doing your social media training.
Yeah, long.
In terms of a very quick answer to the health claims question you threw in, and we do, of course, now have a UK process, having left the European Union. I think I'm right in saying to date they have approved no new health claims, and effectively we're still governed by those European rules at the moment in terms of what you say, and they tend to be very nutrient focused, of course. And whilst we do have dietary guidelines, they don't tend to get communicated very well. We are almost out of time, so I'm deliberately picking one which I hope will be a quick answer, and it's for you, Martina, which is around, are you aware of other work that is going on around the kind of food matrix effects that you talked of in animal foods or in any other foods?
Yeah, so there's lots of foods ongoing all the time. So definitely some of the cheese and dairy work does use meat, for example, as a comparator, as well as another source of saturated fat. But even looking, say, outside of dairy completely, looking at the effect of cooking or boiling on food, for example, carrots, or types of cooking on beef to see how that affects digestion and things as well. There is lots of work going into the effect of the food matrix on all types of food and on digestion and later health as well. So there's a lot of food science work going on. So it's not always linked to health outcomes, let's say. So it might be more food science, simulation, digestive models, that type of thing. There's a lot of work going on that way. But yes, lots going on. If you want to search for it, you will find an unending supply of reading material.
Excellent. Well, I think sadly we are going to have to draw this to an end. These sessions always seem to fly by, and I know that there are quite a lot of questions in the chat that we have not got to. And the speakers are happy for you to contact them directly. Their details will be sent as we send around the recording. So it just remains for me to thank Dr. Anne Mullen, Professor Ian Given, and Dr. Martina Rini. Also to thank all of you for attending our webinar today and for asking lots of questions. It's always great when you have an enthusiastic audience. We are going to share a recording of the webinar, as I mentioned. That's going to include the Q&A session. It will come to you via email. It's also going to be online at the IFST's webinars hub, which is straightforwardly ifst.org/webinars. Before you log off, one final plea is please could you fill out the short survey, which will pop up on your screens automatically. It really helps both the IFST and so the Nutrition and Food Science Special Interest Group to know what it is that you would like to hear from us, and it helps us to devise future programmes for you. So once again, thanks very much to Anne, Ian and Martina, and goodbye.